The first time my brother laughed about my job in front of strangers, I thought it would stay small. One awkward joke, a few polite chuckles. Then the music would start again and people would forget. That's not what happened. The room smelled faintly like spilled champagne and something sweet from the kitchen. A band was tuning their instruments somewhere behind me. You know that thin screech a violin makes before a song starts? Yeah. That sound kept cutting through the air while my brother raised his glass. Lucas Whitaker has always liked a crowd. Anyway, my name is Hannah Whitaker, 32 years old. I was standing near the back of a wedding reception in the Hudson Valley, holding a tiny wrapped gift I'd almost talked myself out of bringing. The place was one of those vineyard estates people rent for weddings when money isn't really a concern. Long wooden tables, white candles everywhere. Everyone dressed like they'd stepped out of a magazine. I did not look like that. Just a navy dress I'd worn to a couple other things before. Nothing fancy. Honestly, I was hoping to stay invisible the whole night. Lucas was already halfway through his toast when I realized he was talking about me. He lifted his glass toward my side of the room and said, smiling real wide, "And that's my sister Hannah." A few heads turned. Then he added, casual as anything, "She's a nanny, spends most of her time raising other people's kids." Somebody at the table laughed. Not a big laugh. Just one of those quick ones people do when they think they're supposed to. Lucas kept going. Someone in the family had to take the simpler path. More laughter this time. Softer. But it spread across the tables like a ripple. I swear you could feel it moving through the room. I didn't say anything. I've learned that trick over the years. When Lucas is performing for an audience, arguing just feeds him. So I stood there holding my stupid little gift box and smiled like it didn't matter. The thing is, I've been a nanny for almost 10 years. I take care of kids whose parents are busy running companies or traveling or whatever. It's not glamorous, but I'm good at it. Really good. Actually, Lucas has never seen it that way. Across the head table, someone set down a fork with a small metallic clink. That's when I noticed the bride's father looking at me, not the quick, polite glance people usually give. This man was staring. Silver hair, dark suit. His expression wasn't angry or amused. It looked more like confusion, like he was trying to pull a memory out of somewhere deep and it kept slipping away. Lucas kept talking about honeymoon plans and vineyards in Italy. People laughed again. But the older man didn't look away from me. Not once. And after about a minute of that, he slowly turned to Lucas and said something that made the entire table go quiet. "Lucas," he said carefully, "what did you say your sister's name was again?" "When Richard Langford asked my name again?" Lucas laughed like the question was harmless. "Hannah," he said. "Hannah Whitaker. My sister." Richard repeated it under his breath. "Hannah." Lucas shrugged. "Yeah, she's the nanny I was talking about." A couple people near him smiled politely. The bride Victoria reached over and touched his arm like she was trying to smooth the moment out. "Lucas," she said softly, "maybe let your sister sit." I was still standing beside the long table, holding that gift box like an idiot. My hands had started to feel warm and slippery against the wrapping paper. Lucas waved a hand at me. "You can go back to your seat if you want." I nodded once and stepped away. Honestly, that should have been the end of it. People were already turning back to their plates. Someone down the table started talking about a real estate deal in Boston. Another guy was describing a ski house in Vermont like he was selling it, but I could still feel Richard Langford watching me. I sat at the end of a table with two women I didn't know. One of them leaned slightly toward the other and whispered, not that quietly, "She's the sister," the other woman said. I thought she worked for them or something. I pretended not to hear. You ever notice how people talk more freely when they think you're beneath them? It's weirdly educational. Across the room, Lucas was still telling stories. He had his arm around Victoria now. Italy first, he was saying. Then the Amalfi Coast. Someone asked, "How long are you staying 3 weeks?" Lucas said, Figured we'd start married life properly. Laughter again. Then Richard's voice cut through it. Lucas. Not loud, just steady. Lucas stopped mid-sentence. Yeah, Richard was still looking toward my table. How long has your sister been working as a nanny? Lucas shrugged. Almost 10 years, I think. 10 years, Richard repeated slowly. Lucas grinned. Yeah, she's basically a professional babysitter. That line got another small ripple of laughter. But Richard didn't laugh. He leaned back slightly in his chair, eyes still fixed on me like a puzzle he couldn't solve. And then he said something that made the air around the table tighten. Hannah, he called across the room. I looked up. Did you ever work in Connecticut? When Richard asked about Connecticut, the room didn't explode into drama or anything like that. It just paused. That weird kind of silence where people pretend they're still eating, but you can tell they're listening. I wiped my hands on my napkin and looked over at him. Yeah, I said. For a few years. Lucas laughed softly from the head table. See, he said to the guests near him. Told you. My sisters basically worked every rich neighborhood in the Northeast. A couple people smiled again. Richard didn't. He leaned forward a little. His fork was still resting on the plate in front of him. Untouched now. What town, he asked. Greenwich. I said. Lucas let out a quick whistle. Of course it was Greenwich. He turned to the table beside him. That's where all the hedge fund guys hide their money. Victoria nudged him lightly. Lucas. What he said. I'm kidding. I could feel people glancing between us. Honestly, I was already planning to excuse myself after dinner. Weddings are long. You stay long enough to be polite, and then you disappear before the dancing starts. That was the plan anyway. Richard was still watching me. How long ago were you there? He asked. 5 years, I said. He went very still. Lucas noticed it too. Dad. You good, Victoria asked him quietly. Richard didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked back at me like he was measuring something in his head. 5 years, he repeated again. Lucas laughed under his breath. Richard. If you're trying to figure out if Hannah babysat someone you know, I promise the odds are pretty high. That got a few small chuckles. Lucas leaned back in his chair and lifted his wine glass. My sister's basically the most overqualified babysitter in 3 states. More laughter. But Richard's expression didn't move. Not even a little. He rubbed his chin slowly and then asked one more question. What family were you working for in Greenwich? I opened my mouth, then stopped for a second. Honestly, I hadn't thought about that house in a long time. The Parkers, I said. And that's when Richard Langford pushed his chair back from the table. When I said the Parkers, Richard Langford's chair shifted back a few inches. Not a big dramatic move. Just enough that the legs scraped lightly across the floor and a couple people nearby glanced up. Lucas noticed it right away. Everything okay? He asked. Richard didn't answer him at first. He was looking straight at me now. The Parkers, he said slowly, like he was testing the name in his head. Yeah, I replied. Daniel and Laura Parker. Lucas leaned back in his chair again, half smiling like the whole thing was some harmless dinner curiosity. See? He said to the guests near him. Told you she worked for rich people. Victoria touched his arm. Lucas. What he said. It's not an insult. Richard didn't react to that. His attention stayed on me. You worked for them as their nanny, he asked. Yeah. How long were you there? About 3 years. He nodded slowly, thinking. Across the table, someone set down a fork with a quiet clink. The room had that strange, half-listening feeling again, like people were pretending to focus on dinner, but their ears had drifted over here. Richard rubbed his chin once. I remember hearing something about that house a few years ago, he said. Lucas raised an eyebrow. What kind of something? Richard ignored him and kept speaking to me. Did something happen there one winter? I hesitated. Honestly, the memory had been sitting in the back of my mind for years, like a box you don't open unless you have to. Yeah, I said. Something happened. Lucas let out a small laugh. Now you've got my attention. Victoria sighed softly. Lucas, please. Richard leaned forward a little. I read about a house fire in Greenwich, he said carefully. Big place, electrical issue in the basement. The word fire moved through the table like a quiet ripple. I felt the memory come back before I could stop it. Yeah, I said. Lucas swirled his wine in the glass. So, the Parkers had a fire. That's the story. Richard's eyes never left mine. I remember the report said a child was pulled out safely. He continued. Someone at the table shifted in their chair, and that the nanny helped get everyone out. Lucas gave a small shrug. Well, that sounds like Hannah. Richard held my gaze a moment longer. Then, he said quietly, Did you go back inside that house? When Richard asked if I went back inside the house, Lucas gave a short laugh. Wait, he said, leaning forward. Now I really want to hear this. Richard didn't look at him. His attention stayed on me. I remember reading about that fire, he said slowly. Large house in Greenwich, winter. Electrical problem in the basement. I nodded once. Yeah, I said. That sounds right. Lucas lifted his glass again. So the Parkers had a fire. That happens. Victoria glanced at him. Lucas. What he said. I'm listening. Richard continued. The article said a child got out safely. He paused, thinking. A little girl. Sophie, I said quietly. Richard looked at me more closely now. That's her name, he said. Lucas leaned back again, eyebrows raised. So my sister carried a kid out of a house. That's the heroic part. No, Richard said calmly. That's the first part. The table had gone quiet in that slow way where people stop pretending they're not listening. Richard looked back at me. The report said the nanny woke the child and got her outside. I nodded. She was asleep upstairs. I said, Smoke alarm woke me first. Lucas watched me now instead of smiling. You grabbed the girl, he said, and ran out. Yeah. Richard spoke again. And later they said someone went back inside. The memory came back sharper now. Smoke thick in the hallway, heat coming up through the floor. I rubbed my hands together without thinking. I thought everyone was out. I said. Then I realized someone wasn't. Lucas frowned slightly. You went back into the house. I didn't think about it much. I said. I just went. Victoria's voice was barely above a whisper. Oh my God. Richard nodded slowly. The article said the nanny helped pull someone out before the firefighters arrived. Lucas looked between us. Okay, he said. Now I'm confused. Richard finally turned his head toward him. The man who was inside the house survived, he said. Lucas shrugged. Good for him. Richard looked back at me again. The story never mentioned his name. I didn't answer, because suddenly I understood where this was going. Richard leaned forward slightly, but it did say one thing very clearly. He paused. That the nanny didn't leave him behind. Lucas shook his head slowly. So you're telling me my sister ran back into a burning house? Richard met his eyes. Yes. Lucas looked at me again. And she dragged someone out. Richard nodded once. That's exactly what she did. When Richard said I dragged someone out of the house, Lucas leaned forward like he was finally interested. Okay, he said. Now I need to hear this. Victoria whispered his name again, but Lucas ignored her. Richard looked straight at me. You found him in the hallway, he said. The memory came back clear now. Smoke everywhere. The alarm screaming so loud my ears hurt. The carpet rough under my knees. Yeah, I said. Lucas lifted his glass and took a sip. So, who was it, he asked. One of the Parker parents. Richard shook his head slowly. No. Lucas frowned. Then who? Richard didn't answer him. Instead, he asked me another question. You tried to wake him first, didn't you? I nodded. He wasn't moving, I said. He was on the floor. Someone at the table across from us shifted in their chair. A fork dropped with a small clatter. Lucas said, "Wait. You're telling me my sister dragged a grown man out of a burning house? I didn't drag him the whole way," I said. "I kind of pulled him. Half dragged, half pushed." Lucas laughed once. "That sounds safe." Richard ignored him. "You told him to stay awake," he said. I blinked. "Yeah, you kept saying it over and over." My throat felt dry suddenly. I remembered the weight of the man's arm over my shoulder, the smoke stinging my eyes. "Stay with me," I had said. "Just keep breathing." Lucas set his glass down. "Hold on," he said slowly. "How do you know all this?" Richard finally turned his head toward him, because for the first time since this conversation started, Lucas sounded confused instead of amused. Richard spoke very quietly. "Because I was that man." No one laughed this time. Victoria's hand covered her mouth. Lucas stared at his father-in-law like the words had come out in the wrong order. Richard kept looking at me. "You pulled me through the front door," he said, "and then you collapsed in the driveway." The room was completely still now. Lucas looked back at me, then back at Richard, and finally he said the only thing he could come up with. "You're saying my sister saved your life." When Lucas finally said it out loud, "My sister saved your life," the table went still. Not dramatic. Just that strange pause when people suddenly realize the story isn't entertainment anymore. Richard answered calmly, "Yes." Lucas blinked like he needed a second to reset the moment. "Wait," he said. "You're serious?" Richard nodded once. "I'm alive because of her." Victoria's hand moved slowly to her mouth. "Dad." But Richard kept speaking, steady and quiet. "The electrical panel in the Parker basement caught fire," he said. "It filled the house with smoke before anyone realized what was happening." He looked at me again. "Hannah smelled it first." I shrugged a little. "Smoke alarms help," I said. Also being the only one awake at 2 a.m. A couple people shifted in their chairs. Lucas leaned back slowly, still trying to process it. "So she wakes up, grabs the kid, and runs outside." Richard nodded. "She carried Sophie out first." Victoria looked at him, confused. "Sophie never told me that." "She was 4, Richard said gently. "What she remembers are the fire trucks." He paused. "But I remember something else." The room had grown quieter without anyone asking for it. Richard turned his head slightly toward Lucas. "When I woke up, the hallway was full of smoke," he said. "I couldn't see anything, could barely breathe." Lucas frowned. "So how did you even know someone was there?" Richard answered without hesitation. I heard her voice. He looked at me. "You kept shouting at me." I rubbed my fingers along the edge of the tablecloth. "Yeah," I muttered. "That sounds like me." Richard repeated the words slowly. "Don't fall asleep. Stay with me." Lucas stared at me now. "You never told me this happened." I shrugged. "Didn't seem important." That landed harder than I expected. Lucas didn't say anything. Richard continued. "She got my arm over her shoulder and pulled me down the hallway." He said, "By the time we reached the front door, the firefighters were pulling hoses up the driveway." Victoria whispered again. Softer this time. "Oh my God." Richard nodded once. "She got me outside, and then she collapsed in the driveway." Someone further down the table muttered quietly, "That's unbelievable." Lucas rubbed his face with one hand. "So you're telling me this whole time?" He trailed off. Richard finished the sentence for him. "This whole time your sister was the reason my granddaughter still has a grandfather." Silence settled over the table. Lucas looked at me again. Not the way he had earlier. This time he looked unsettled, like something he believed about the world had shifted a little. Then he glanced down at his wine glass and muttered under his breath, "She's still a nanny." When Lucas muttered, "She's still a nanny," it wasn't loud, but the whole table heard it. Victoria turned slowly toward him, her expression tightening in a way I hadn't seen before. "Lucas," she said quietly. What he replied, shrugging. "I'm just stating a fact." Richard Langford placed both hands flat on the table. His voice wasn't raised, but there was something firm in it now. "You didn't just say she's a nanny," he said. "You said just a nanny." Lucas leaned back in his chair like the distinction didn't matter. "Well, she is." Nobody laughed this time. A few guests shifted in their seats. Someone set down a glass with a soft tap. Richard shook his head slowly. "You're missing the point." Lucas gave a short breath through his nose. "No," he said. "I think I understand it perfectly." He looked around the table like he was still trying to pull the room back onto his side. "My sister did something brave once." "That's great." He lifted his wine glass slightly. "But it doesn't change what she does for a living." Richard leaned forward a little. "Lucas," he said calmly, "your sister ran into a burning house." Lucas shrugged. "Yeah, she carried my granddaughter outside." Lucas took a slow sip of wine. "Okay." She went back inside. Richard continued, his voice steady. "And she pulled a grown man through smoke and fire." Lucas set the glass down, and the word landed heavier than he probably meant it to. Victoria whispered, "Lucas, please." But Richard wasn't looking at her. His eyes stayed fixed on Lucas. "You introduced the bravest person in this room like she was something to apologize for." The table stayed completely still. Lucas didn't answer right away. He glanced toward me. Not angry, not embarrassed, just annoyed. Like the night had suddenly become inconvenient. "You're acting like she's a firefighter," he said. Richard's voice dropped slightly. "I'm acting like she saved 2 lives. Someone further down the table whispered something under their breath. A chair creaked softly as someone shifted. Lucas looked around the room again. For the first time that evening, people weren't smiling at him. Then he exhaled slowly and said, "She chose that life." Richard tilted his head. "What life?" Lucas gestured toward me with one hand. "That one," he said. He paused before finishing the thought. Living in other people's houses. Raising their kids. His voice stayed casual, almost dismissive. But that's what she wanted. I finally spoke. "Actually," I said, "I wanted the kids to be safe." Lucas rolled his eyes slightly. "Here we go." Richard didn't look away from him. "You're ashamed of her," he said quietly. Lucas opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. And for the first time that night, Lucas Whitaker didn't have a line ready. Lucas didn't answer Richard right away. He looked down at the table like the wood grain might help him think. Then he said, quietly, "I'm not ashamed." Richard didn't blink. "Then why did you say, 'just a nanny'?" Lucas rubbed the back of his neck. "It was a joke." Victoria spoke for the first time in a while. It didn't sound like a joke. Lucas looked at her. "Madeline Victoria," she corrected softly. "My name is Victoria." That landed harder than anything Richard had said. Lucas looked around the table like he suddenly realized every guest was still listening. "I didn't mean it like that," he said. I shrugged. "It's fine." Lucas turned toward me quickly. "No, it's not like you think." I leaned back in my chair. "Lucas, you've been saying the same thing about my job for 10 years. That made him stop talking. Richard glanced between us. "You never told him he asked me. Told him what that night." I shook my head. "He didn't ask." Lucas let out a slow breath. "You're saying you never once thought to mention that you pulled someone out of a burning house." I smiled a little. "Honestly, yeah. I didn't think you'd care." Nobody said anything after that. Across the room, the band started playing again. Soft piano this time. One of the waiters walked past carrying a tray that smelled faintly like garlic and butter. Lucas stared at the table. Victoria folded her hands quietly in her lap. Richard looked at me for a long second, Then he said something I wasn't expecting. "You didn't do it for attention?" "No," I said. He nodded slowly. That's why it mattered. After that, the reception slowly came back to life. People started talking again. Glasses touched. The band picked up another song like nothing unusual had happened, but our table stayed quiet. Lucas stood first. He looked at the table, then finally at me. "I didn't know," he said. I nodded once. "I know." He shifted his weight like he was searching for something else to say, something that might smooth the whole thing over. It didn't come. After a moment, he muttered, "I guess I underestimated you." I shrugged. Most people do. Richard let out a quiet laugh under his breath. Victoria stood and rested a hand lightly on my shoulder. "I'm really glad you came tonight," she said. "Me too," I answered. A little later, I stepped outside the hall. Cool air, gravel crunching under my shoes. Honestly, I didn't come to that wedding to prove anything. I came because Lucas is still my brother. Families are strange like that. People can know you your whole life and still decide who you are based on one label, a job title, a joke at a dinner table. But here's something I've learned. Work doesn't lose its value just because someone else doesn't understand it. Taking care of people matters. Keeping children safe matters. If you've ever had someone dismiss the work you do, don't waste time arguing. Just keep doing it well. The right people see it eventually, and sometimes that's enough.